On November 1, 1396, St. Paul's Cathedral in London shimmered in the glow of hundreds of candles, their light dancing across Gothic stained glass windows. The organ's solemn notes echoed through the sacred space, blending with the rhythmic steps of a stately procession. Thousands of eyes turned toward the end of the central aisle, where a royal wedding was about to take place. But this was no ordinary union. It was one of the most controversial and haunting events in European history. The central figures of the ceremony were Isabelle of France, a child princess barely 6 years old, and Richard II of England, a king of 29. The staggering age gap was not born of love, but the ruthless logic of a blood-soaked political chessboard where a child was sacrificed to broker peace. Clad in a heavy, ornate gown, the tiny girl walked slowly along the cold stone floor of the cathedral. The crown perched on her head was far too heavy for such a delicate figure, forcing her to tilt slightly as if on the verge of collapse. Ahead of her stood Richard II, regal in a robe of radiant golden silk, its sweeping train glistening in the candle light. In mere minutes, Isabelle, a child who days before had been clutching her dolls, would be proclaimed Queen of England. Why did such an extraordinary wedding occur? The answer lies in the cold calculations of late 14th century European politics. After decades of bloodshed in the Hundred Years' War, both England and France were exhausted. Richard II, mourning the loss of his first wife and of Bohemia, faced not only grief but looming internal crises, rebellion, financial ruin, and the shadow of usurpers. Peace with France was no mere wish, it was a matter of survival. Across the Channel, the French crown, crippled by civil unrest and King Charles VI's madness, sought the same respite. The French council, led by the Duke of Berry, saw an opportunity, a marriage in exchange for peace. The terms were staggering: a 28-year truce and a colossal dowry of £800,000, an astronomical sum then, worth hundreds of millions today. Negotiations dragged on for months. The emissaries debated not over land or treasure, but over the fate of a child. Some English counselors balked at Isabelle's tender age, urging the wedding be delayed until she turned 12, the canonical age for consent. But Richard II, desperate and cornered, could not wait. He needed French gold and peace immediately. Moral qualms gave way to political necessity, and so, beneath the soaring vaults of St. Paul's, to the strains of solemn music, a covenant was sealed with the blood of childhood. Isabelle, still dreaming of childish games, became the queen of a foreign realm. Behind the glitter of ceremony lurked the shadows of a tragedy, the story of a little girl stripped of her innocence to serve the ambitions of men. Isabelle of France was born on November 9, 1389, in the Louvre Palace, the beating heart of French power. In name, she was among the noblest of Europe's daughters, child of King Charles VI and Queen Isabelle of Bavaria. Yet behind this grandeur lay a world poisoned by madness, ambition, and betrayal, a world that would define her fragile destiny. Her father, Charles VI, would be remembered by history as Charles the Mad. His mental afflictions began at 24 and worsened throughout his reign. In his delirium, he forgot his own name, failed to recognize wife and children, believed his body was glass that could shatter with a touch, and sometimes ran screaming through palace corridors, pursued by imaginary foes. His madness destroyed not only a man, but an entire kingdom. With the king incapacitated, power fell to a regency council, a cabal of dukes and princes who turned governance into a battlefield of ambition. The French court became a nest of intrigue and bloodshed, the setting in which Isabelle spent her earliest years, a palace glittering with jewels but echoing with treachery and fear. If her father's madness plunged France into chaos, her mother's ambition turned Isabelle's life into a pawn's game. Isabelle of Bavaria, famed for beauty and ruthlessness, seized control during Charles's episodes of insanity, amassing wealth and power for her Bavarian kin. To her, children were not cherished lives but bargaining chips. Isabelle, the fourth daughter, was no exception. This toxic court, riven by civil war between Armagnacs and Burgundians and drained by a foreign conflict spanning generations, offered no sanctuary for innocence. Isabelle, a sensitive child, witnessed scenes no child should see: screaming quarrels, sudden deaths, a father broken by madness, a mother cold as marble. Instead of lullabies, her nights were filled with whispers of diplomacy and speculation on her value in the marriage market. Thus, her fate was sealed. At 6, Isabelle was sacrificed on the altar of statecraft, her life exchanged for peace. Her union with Richard II, a man nearly 5 times her age, was no fairy tale, but the inevitable result of an age where royal children were born not to live, but to serve. And so, on November 1, 1396, St. Paul's Cathedral hosted one of the most surreal weddings in history. Beneath a canopy of silks, amid the blaze of imported candles, a little girl strained under the weight of a crown as she approached a king in gold. The organ thundered, Latin choirs sang, and as the ring slid onto a finger barely large enough to hold it, the crowd cried out, "Long live the Queen!" But the child stood silent, eyes searching the crowd for a familiar face that was not there. In that moment, Europe hailed a queen. In truth, it created a prisoner, a living symbol of peace, whose chains were woven of silk and gold. Richard, to his credit, treated Isabelle as a daughter rather than a wife, granting her tutors and attendants, shielding her from scandal. Yet her security was illusory. She was a hostage wrapped in velvet, her body the treaty, her soul the price. And this was only the beginning. Within 3 years, the crown that had crushed her small head would become her shroud. Isabelle was taken to Havering Castle, a quiet fortress in Essex, where she would spend 3 long years in what was called luxurious captivity. She still retained the formal honors of a queen and a small retinue, but in truth, she was a prisoner watched closely, forbidden to leave England, and cut off from the outside world. In solitude, Isabelle changed. The carefree little girl was gone, replaced by a child far older than her years. Chroniclers record the letters she sent home to France, letters soaked in tears, filled with despair and a desperate longing for freedom. "I write to you in tears. I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all that I love, with no hope of returning." These words revealed more than sorrow. They bared the soul of a child crushed beneath the weight of merciless political designs. It would take 3 years of fierce negotiation before the French court forced Henry IV to release her. In 1401, Isabelle finally set foot on her homeland again. But the girl who returned to France was no longer the innocent child of 1396. Captivity had carved deep wounds in her spirit, leaving a solemn, silent young woman of 12 with eyes far older than her face. Yet her return brought no lasting joy. France remained a land in chaos, torn by civil war and the endless struggle against England. Her family did not greet her with warmth, but with the cold indifference of those who saw her as a piece already played on the board upon of no further value. From a Queen of England in name, Isabelle became a forgotten child widow, carrying the greatest tragedy of all, a stolen childhood, and a future still dictated by the hands of others. But this was not the final chapter in her sorrowful life. Only a few years after escaping captivity, she would again be drawn into the cruel game of political marriage. After 3 years as a hostage, Isabelle's freedom in 1401 seemed a deliverance, yet it brought little happiness. France was still fractured by the 100 Years' War and the bloody feud between Armagnacs and Burgundians. Her father, King Charles VI, remained tormented by fits of madness. Even within her own family, Isabelle found no refuge. Queen Isabeau, ambitious and calculating, received her daughter with the coldness of a woman who saw her child as a discarded political asset. Isabelle was no longer the Queen of England, no longer useful for alliances, and so she was set aside in the vicious dance of power. The years that followed were quiet, but heavy with loneliness. Isabelle lived at court, a slender, graceful girl hardened by grief. Yet fate had not finished with her. In 1405, at the age of 16, Isabelle was given in marriage once more. Her new husband was Charles, Duke of Orleans, among the most distinguished and wealthy young nobles in France. Like her first union, this marriage served a political end. But there was one profound difference. Love blossomed between them, Charles was no cold statesman. He was a poet, a soul of verse and song renowned for his romantic lyrics in medieval French literature. In the halls of Orleans, Isabelle discovered for the first time the simple joy of being cherished. They shared poetry readings, spoke of art and music, and found solace in each other's company. To Charles, Isabelle was not a pawn but a beloved wife. For a fleeting span, she lived as a woman rather than a bargaining chip. Her happiness deepened when she bore a daughter, Jean d'Orleans, the only child she would ever have. That little girl was a beacon of light in a life shadowed by darkness, but joy in Isabelle's world was always fragile. In 1407, as France's internal strife raged on, Charles was captured in battle, taken prisoner by the English during the bitter conflicts that scarred the kingdom. He would remain a captive for 25 years, one of the longest-held noble prisoners of the 100 Years' War. For Isabelle, the blow was shattering. Once more, she was left alone, not this time in enemy hands, but abandoned in her own land. At 18, she was a widow in all but name, though her marriage bonds still held. She clung to hope by raising her daughter and dreaming of Charles's return. But her frail health, worn by years of sorrow, could not withstand the strain. In 1409, at just 20 years old, Isabelle died from complications after childbirth. Her passing was so quiet that it barely stirred the chronicles, a hushed end to a life never lived for itself. Isabelle, the girl queen at 6, widow at 10, bride at 16, dead at 20, remains one of history's starkest witnesses to the cruelty of political marriage. At the moment of her death in Paris, no pomp, no silks, no organ music marked her departure. The child who once wore a crown heavy enough to bow her head was laid to rest with little more than a whisper. Her life is a tapestry of sacrifice. Torn from her toys to wear a crown, made queen for peace, stripped of youth for treaties, Isabelle's existence was not her own. Her story is more than personal tragedy, it is a mirror held to an age where the bodies and souls of children were currency in the brutal economy of power. Even now, 6 centuries later, Isabelle's shadow lingers, asking the question, can a peace purchased with a child's life ever truly be peace? Isabelle of France died young, but her silence still speaks. It tells us that behind every crown lies a price, and sometimes, that price is an entire childhood stolen in the name of kings.